Labas vakaras visiems susirinkusiems. Iškart noriu pasakyti, kad mes kalbėsime angliškai, todėl dar kartą primenu, kam reikia vertimo, ausinės yra už durų. So good evening, everyone. Today we have a special occasion and really unique meeting. We're presenting new translated, freshly translated into Lithuanian book on 14 Dalai Lamas. As well, we have an author of this book. That's really amazing life story, having a scholar, famous tibetologist, Mullinas, who has spent around 15 years in Indian Himalayas, who has written 25 books on various aspects of Tibetan Buddhist culture, philosophy, religion, who had 35 teachers. You can imagine 35 teachers from various Tibetan Buddhist schools, who has founded in United States, in North America, how it is called, the Mystical Arts of Tibet Society, that is dealing with promotion of Tibetan culture, Tibetan art, mandala ceremonies and similar things, as well as Mullinas is well-known tourist guide, organizing annual trips to holy places in Tibet, north of India, Bhutan, Nepal, and perhaps Mongolia as well. So we should use our today occasion to put forward all possible questions to know not only about this book, not only about circumstances why this book was written, but also to know about experience of our guest as well. So can maybe we start from, I will take a seat, from the beginning, coming back to the circumstances to write this book. What was intention behind? Exactly if we are talking about this book.
Sanga choran sogi shonam la jenjobara dami kebsuchi dagi jinsoji basonangi drula penser sanga drud parsho. I thought I'd speak in Tibetan here in Vilnius rather than English, because Dalai Lama has visited so many times that I think all of you must know some Tibetan. In terms of this, this particular book, I had the good fortune to meet with Dalai Lama and Tibetan masters in early 1970s, and to be inspired to try to train in that tradition. And after a few years, I learned my Tibetan became quite good. And at that time, there wasn't much in English on Tibetan Buddhism, and there was really nothing on Dalai Lama's gold, was known as the Sershagilok, the golden hat lineage of the golden hat. So I started translating materials and writing studies of different meditation traditions, yogic traditions, and so forth. And then I started working a little bit on the lives and teachings of early Dalai Lamas. And I did about 12 or maybe 15 books on early Dalai Lamas. And then some of my friends started to complain that they couldn't afford to buy so many books. So would I please do one book with all the Dalai Lamas in it? So it's the only book I've ever written at the request of others. Otherwise, my other books were books I wrote because of my own kind of karmic influences.
Yes, you're very right, telling about the importance of His Holiness Dalai Lama for Lithuania, as he has visited 5 times already Lithuania, and just half a year ago last visit. But certainly we have to recognize that in Lithuania we know not so much about the previous Dalai Lamas. Mm-hmm. And probably, that's my opinion, your book is unique in that sense, as it is providing a broad general picture of Dalai Lama institution. And I would say that my impression that this book is kind of, I wanted to say concise, but it is not concise, history of Tibetan Buddhist tradition as well. So how you were able to put together all lives in one?
Yes, I think one issue is the idea of reincarnation. So when Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, he said, I feel I'm getting this not for so much for what I have done, but rather because of the role of all Dalai Lamas, the role different Dalai Lamas have played. And yesterday when we were having dinner, we were talking about some kind of political roles of the Dalai Lama. And I mentioned that, in fact, Dalai Lamas have played almost no political role in the lives of Central Asians, but rather they've really played the role of peacemaker. And so when Dalai Lama made that statement, it really sort of struck home with me quite deeply. So in one way, the story of all the Dalai Lamas is really just the story of the adventures of one human soul told in different chapters. So when the second Dalai Lama, who was one of my 2 or 3 favorites, when he was getting ready to pass away in, what was it, 1542 or something like that, he looked at his body and he said, this body of mine is starting to give aches and pains and signals of wanting to find a new source. And that when I look down at my body, I think it would be very nice if it were like the body of a fresh young baby. So in a way, the story of the 14 Dalai Lamas is just the story of one person told in 14 chapters. But of course, the first Dalai Lama wasn't an invention or a creation. Before that, he was someone, and before that, he was someone back throughout time. So I had to give a chapter or 2 to what are the myths, the legends, and the histories of the Dalai Lama lineage from before the time of the first Dalai Lama. I think, in a way, we can do that with any human, can't we? We can tell the whole history of the universe just through any of you here, if we were to have someone who could look deep into your eyes and read your last, 5,000 or 10,000 lifespans. A little bit like, I don't know if you ever saw the film The Red Violin, talking about the life of a Stradivarius violin, starting out in Italy and then ending up in, I think, France, and then over in England, and then up in Switzerland, and then in communist China. And in a way, it's just the story of one violin. But each of those chapters tells a very different story. So with Dalai Lamas, I wanted to do that, but the Dalai Lamas for me were special because the Dalai Lama was, I think, the first Tibetan I met in a very intimate way when I came to Dharamsaloye to study at the institute he had created for Western people. And he was very, very kind to all of us Westerners there. He treated us almost like, I don't know, like he was like a father hen and we were like little chicks or something like that. Or he was like sort of a big brother, I guess. And for all the years, I spent 12 years continuously studying, not just with him. He appointed 2 teachers to teach us, and also his gurus, Ling Rinpoche, Trijun Rinpoche, Serkan Rinpoche, those great masters. And so it was really sort of an exploration of all the myths, legends, and so forth about the Dalai Lamas, which in some way reflect the beauty that I see in this Dalai Lama, or the magnificence I see in this Dalai Lama. And of course, to go through what they wrote and what they said and to choose some of the best of their writings in terms of something that would work in a book of this size. The 5th Dalai Lama alone, for instance, wrote 28 volumes, which is maybe 1,000 titles. So it had to be selective. When I say magnificence of Dalai Lama and so on, I would say I don't hold the Dalai Lama so high that I worship him. And I don't see him as an ordinary person in the same way that I see most ordinary people, but rather I see him as a person who has an extraordinary role to play in this world. And I feel very honored to have been able to participate in some small way in the fulfillment of, I would say, his destiny on the planet Earth. So with all early Dalai Lamas, I was the first one to translate works by the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 13th Dalai Lamas. So and in that way, I think those translations helped him with his work a little bit in that they help people understand earlier chapters of that saga. From my own side, of course, I was more interested in the enlightenment aspect. I didn't become a Buddhist in order to say I'm a Buddhist. I didn't study Buddhism in order to be able to talk more intelligently about Buddhism. I didn't take up Buddhist yoga and meditation as a kind of a hobby. I really did have the sense, first on meeting Dalai Lama, then on meeting his 2 gurus, Ling Rinpoche and Trijun Rinpoche, that enlightenment is something that anyone could achieve. And I had the sense that, me too. So you could say I joined the Me Too movement in terms of enlightenment quest. And I would have to add that I was not at all disappointed. I studied continually for 12 years, and each year I felt great personal benefit, both in my own soul and also in my own external life. I think there is this tradition in Buddhism where what happens inside and what happens outside is not a contradictory situation. That what helps inside should also help in your outer life.
By the way, how do you think What is the future of this institution of Dalai Lama, keeping in mind the present situation with Tibet, with Tibetan diaspora, and also keeping in mind that Dalai Lama himself has stated so many times that probably he will not be reincarnated again as Dalai Lama, or he expressed some few times that maybe he will be incarnated next time as a woman. And a few years ago, we heard the statement of China Communist Party that it is not proper way for His Holiness not to reincarnate. It is his religious duty. He cannot abandon this institution. Of course, there is intention behind to manipulate new incarnation issues as we have with Panchen Lama. So what is your personal opinion, keeping in mind that everyone who read this book will get really extremely deep feeling of importance of this institution for all history, all Tibetan history? Not only Tulku, but in general Dalai Lama reincarnation institution. So what you can tell about this?
Well, I think just like Socrates and Plato and the early Greek masters, the Dalai Lama is very much a reincarnationist. So when he says he won't reincarnate, it doesn't mean he will never appear. And in the early 1980s, and during the time of the Polish solidarity movement, when Russia and America were thinking of maybe having a limited nuclear war to experiment with their little nukes that only affect 5 miles of area. So as a result, the CIA was translating everything ever published in Polish, because they weren't sure what was going on or what would be relevant. And one of the things they translated was an interview with a Polish journalist saying he would be the last, with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama saying he might be the last Dalai Lama, or he would be the last Dalai Lama. And Associated Press asked me to interview him on that. And at the time, the Dalai Lama replied, well, it's true, every kind of institution, formal institution, has a lifespan. And so it might be that he could be the last Dalai Lama as a formal institution. So I said to him, in that case, what will you do? You'll be out of a job. You've been doing that for 600 years. And he said, maybe I'll come back as a dog, or a book, or a bridge, or an ordinary American like you. Actually, I'm Canadian, but that's North American, so he was kind of half right. And I'm not that ordinary. But his idea then is, even if there's no Dalai Lama, he continues, his soul continues to fulfill the bodhisattva aspiration. I had this discussion with my dear friend and the translator of my book, Hollis, the other day. We're talking about the 3 kinds of bodhisattva aspirations from the Minto Gyan, the ornament of direct realization, a great Indian classic. A bodhisattva can be like a shepherd, or like a captain of a boat, or a ferryman, as you will, or a king. But in either way, any of those 3 ways, the bodhisattva vow is fulfilled, or the bodhisattva aspiration is fulfilled. One should continue a reincarnation until all living beings have been benefited. And so I know that all of you have already achieved enlightenment, and I am probably the only one in the room who did not achieve enlightenment. And all of you here have just continued manifesting in order to bring me to enlightenment. So I'd like to thank you for that. But with Dalai Lama, the idea, coming from Buddhist scriptures from ancient times and Buddhist masters from many centuries and millenniums, Dalai Lama often signs off with a verse from Shantideva: as long as beings exist and as long as space exists, I will continue to incarnate in ways that will be of benefit to others. And of course, all Central Asians from Eastern Russia, from Burят and Tuva in Siberia, through the Mongol republics, Western China, Tibet, North India, Bhutan, and all of these areas, they always start every meditation session with the little verse I did at the beginning today, which says, in order to benefit all living beings, I will quickly achieve deepest wisdom. So I think he might be the last Dalai Lama, but I think probably not, because I can just call someone a Dalai Lama, or China can call someone a Dalai Lama. At that same interview I did with him on account of the Polish event, he replied also, he said, anyway, I may not come back as Dalai Lama, but the persons with the qualifications to be a Dalai Lama, like a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, sort of a highly evolved soul, if you will, there's always lots of them around. And they can always just grab one of them and give him the name Dalai Lama.
By the way, you mentioned name of translator of this book, Alius Kugavicius, and certainly we have to acknowledge tremendously important activity of Alius. All books you have seen at the entrance to this hall are translated by Alius, and Alius today is with us. Can you show yourself, Alius? Because of his activity, we have really now excellent library on many aspects of Buddhist philosophy, religion, and Tibetan culture. Not only this book, but many others, including precious translation of Lamrim by Tsongkhapa and other texts. But I would like to come back to your personal life story. Still, it sounds a bit amazing. As I know, you've been studying, or you graduated having a diploma in engineering. Yes, you are, by the way, Canadian.
Yes, I'm Canadian, and I went to university on scholarships for engineering.
So why and how suddenly you decided to go to India, to stay here for 15 years, to study, especially that was in the 70s, 80s, still quite curious topics like Tibetan language, Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, to settle here? What was the reason behind it? Comes from your previous lives maybe, or it was kind of new impulse?
Yeah, in the Buddhist mystical texts, they always talk about outer, inner, and secret reasons. And outer really usually means conditions in this life that are very obvious. Inner usually refers to some kind of mental qualities one just exhibits, or inner emotional, intellectual qualities. And secret refers more to multi-lifetime. So from the outer side, I had the good fortune that my mother was a British war bride, and her dad, my grandfather, had been in India as a major in the British Army for many years. And my mom loved literature. So in our house growing up, we had the Upanishads, the Dharmapala, the Tao Te King, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the writings of Kabir, sort of great classics from around the world. So from beginning, that was really my great passion, I think, was the mystical traditions of the world. But I came from an ordinary family, and I got all of my scholarships for university from an institution that thought that English-speaking Quebec people should either go into business or the engineering professions. So as a result, engineering seemed more interesting to me. And but my real passion was this mystical traditions of the world, the spiritual traditions of the world. And after college, I went to England to meet my mother's side of the family. And while there, I heard the Dalai Lama opened a school for Western people. So engineers, basically, we build bridges and the such, or dig tunnels through the earth. So I thought I would like to build a bridge between my mind and enlightenment, or dig a tunnel to the inner recesses of my soul by means of meditation. I traveled to India, went to Dharamsaloye, met with the Dalai Lama, and asked, is enlightenment, what do you think? Someone like me, enlightenment possible? And he laughed very hard and he said, yeah, very possible. A little hard work, but possible. And he was so light and joyful about it, it didn't seem at all intimidating. So I thought, well, I'll study for 3 years and then I'll be a fully enlightened master. And then I'll sit down and have a totally different way of thinking about what I should do. Like if you ask someone unenlightened what they should do and you ask an enlightened person what they should do, it probably will be a different answer. But after 3 years, still not enlightened. So, and then it became 6 and 9 and 12. And by that time, I was completely sort of absorbed into the sort of intricacies of the system. And I think sometimes we think if you study something other than your own tradition, maybe that's like a little bit alien or something like that. But I never had that feeling, nor did I ever have that sense from anyone practicing the Enlightenment tradition. Because I think all Enlightenment means is the fulfillment of your own inner aspirations, or the completion of your own inner aspirations, the deepening of your own destiny, and understanding a little bit more deeply the workings of your own mind and of the world around you. So I never, during those 12 years, ever felt like this is weird stuff. And you know, I grew up in a kind of a very conventional Irish Protestant community. I was a boxer in high school and college, a captain of a hockey team with a defense and lots of elbows and occasional fisticuffs and stuff like that. And I never once felt that anything I was doing with Dalai Lama and the Dalai Lama's teachers and the great masters around him, I never felt even slightly in an alien situation. I would say more than anything, I felt at all times when I was with Dalai Lama's gurus, Ling Rinpoche or Trijung Rinpoche, I felt as relaxed and at home as I did with my own favorite grandfather generation, my own great uncle. After school, when he was 96 and 97, I'd rush home from school to sit beside him and listen to him tell stories of his life and of how things had been 90 years earlier and things like that. And I would always feel totally at home with him and totally joyfully enthralled at the beauty of human life, the magnificence of human life, the amazing possibilities of human life. So for me, studying and remaining training in that way never felt even slightly exotic or esoteric. It felt like the most normal thing in the world, like there was nothing more normal I could do. And when I went home to visit in Canada, after I'd been there for about 6 years, I used to visit Dalai Lama's great Guru Trijang Rinpoche every year for a divination, because my mom's health was a little fragile. And one year he said, well, if you don't visit this year, you won't see her again. So I went back and spent a month with her, and we went back to India, and she passed away 2 weeks later. But when I got back, the biggest compliment, I think, from my father was, oh, Glenn, we're so happy to see you haven't changed at all. So for me, it was like a very natural immersion. It was like going for a swim or spending an evening in the moonlight or something along those lines. But in terms of my own inner life, certainly, I felt great benefits.
In this context, I recalled one joke I heard from one American Jewish scholar who is author of several books on Jewish-Buddhist dialogue, Harold Kazimov. I don't know if you heard him. And that joke, I can tell shortly, is about one elderly Jewish woman who was very much devoted Jewish follower Judaism, living in New York. And one day, suddenly, she announced that she's going to make a very hard pilgrimage to Nepal mountains. All relatives decided to stop her. You are crazy, you are too old to go there, it's a very hard trip. But she said, no, I must go there. I must go to see one teacher there. And after a very hard trip, finally she has reached a very secluded place high in the mountains of Nepal. She approached a monastery high in the mountains. There was a queue of pilgrims waiting to see that great teacher, great Lama. And again, she was waiting there several days, and finally she entered the room in the temple. She approached the Lama sitting inside, and she told, Yoshke, my darling, my son, Elf, go home. So it's a joke how many Jewish are attracted and how many Jewish are famous Buddhist teachers in the West, even in Nepal. But let's come back to your teachers. Still, as I mentioned in the beginning of introduction, for me it's still difficult to imagine, to understand. You mentioned that you had 35 teachers from 4 main schools of Tibetan tradition, and mostly from Gelug, but also from other schools. Mm-hmm. So you never faced a kind of contradiction by combining different schools, different practices. Well, you needed so many teachers. I understand that this is the greatest treasure of Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But what about this number, 35?
Well, I think in the Tibetan tradition, they say there's 2 kinds of students. And one is the kind of student who just likes to have one main teacher. And they give the example of Milarepa, who's student of Marpa, and Lama Dramtumpa, the student of Atisha. They didn't study with many teachers. And just 1 or 2 like that. And then they give examples. The other way is those peoples of a different mental or karmic predisposition who have a different kind of personality. And they give an example of Lama Drum's, Milarepa's Guru Marpa, who had many teachers, or Lama Drum's teacher Atisha, who had many teachers. And I think Dalai Lama has about maybe between 100 and 150 teachers over his lifespan. And I think for some people, too many teachers can be confusing, because you can kind of use it as an excuse to not practice well or to be wishy-washy in your approach. I'm not sure if wishy-washy is a word you can translate into Lithuanian so easily, but anyway, people can be a little wishy-washy like that. But all of my favorite teachers were masters who had many, many teachers themselves. So when I met the Dalai Lama, I thought, well, that's great, I'll just be the Dalai Lama's disciple. Then I met Ling Rinpoche, his teacher, and I thought, he's pretty fabulous. And then I met his other teacher, Trijang Rinpoche, and I thought, very, very nice. And then the Dalai Lama had already appointed 2 teachers to teach us, so that already brought it up to 5. And because the Dalai Lama is the sort of spiritual leader of Tibet, and for all Tibetan Lamas of all schools, a kind of a symbol of all Tibetan knowledge, or all Tibetan wisdom, then many great masters would visit with him, and he'd always ask them to give some teachings and also sometimes some initiations and things like that. So my other favorites, Lama Tubjen Yeshe and Lama Tubjen Zopa, who founded the FPMT circle of centers, and I think there's one of those in Riga. I stayed at it when I was here 3 years ago, when I went to Riga to teach a bit. Sakya Trijang Rinpoche, head of Sakya lineage, very, very fabulous. Dilgo Khyentse, who became the head of Nyingma. Trulshik Rinpoche, head of Nyingma for a while. Kalu Rinpoche, head of Shengpa school. So for me, it was never a contradiction. But I kind of grew up in that kind of household. At lunch, our mom would pull up the Rubaiyat of Amar Khayyam and would read a passage from it, and some other day she'd be another mood, and she would read from the person she claimed to be her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who wrote the Shakespeare plays, Sir Francis Bacon. And so she would read from different passages, different sort of great classics a few times a week, just for fun, not in a serious way. It wasn't like sit down and listen, this is important. It was here's a really wonderful poem, a wonderful expression of the beauty of life or the wisdom of life or something like that. And she'd just read it almost like singing a Beatles song, or, I don't know, Beatles for my sister's favorite band. I never liked them that much, but Rolling Stone fan myself. But she'd read it in a very casual way, but in a joyful, celebratory way. And so for me, attending other events for me was just a way of getting deeper understanding of what the Enlightenment tradition was about. And in reality, I think all schools of Tibetan Buddhism are 99.9% the same content. They have 1% different, what they call in Tibetan kechyo, personal way of, peculiarities. Sort of unique way of doing things, or unique lineages which they cherish more than others. But for me, all of the Tibetan Buddhism are all based on the same language format, which was introduced in the same translation formats, and use the same linguistic structure, the same organizational structure in terms of first train in the general trainings like love and compassion and wisdom of emptiness, those things. And then you get into the higher tantric trainings. And there's more, there used to be a saying, every Lama is his own sect. Because often Tibetan Lamas themselves, and Dalai Lama is an example, he's studied with 100 or 100, received teachings and lineages from between 100 and 150 different masters. And that makes him unique in that way. And say Ling Rinpoche perhaps studied with 50 or 60 different masters, but different ones. So everyone sort of has their own uniqueness like that. And for me, it was never at all a problem and I just really enjoyed it very much. Of course, outside of the Tibetan tradition, I also did some study with the Zen tradition and the Theravadan tradition, Japanese Rinzai, Japanese Soto. But for me, my favorite is Tantric Buddhism because I like the richness and the vitality of its language. And also, I think some of the other traditions tend to be a little bit overly monastic and to use overly monastic language. And I'm not really a fan of monasticism. I have nothing against anyone else becoming a monastic. But I remember when I was quite young in my training, maybe 5 or 6 years into my training, I went to Dalai Lama's guru, who was my main teacher. In my heart, I thought of him as my own. I said, should I become a monk? And he looked at me and just started laughing. And said, nope. So for me, I think there was never a problem in that respect with every tradition I've studied with.
Maybe I should mention in this context that Glenn is the father of seven children. So this is also perhaps indication that you are not a monastic guy. Anyway, still I want to...
Well, I think monastic people can have children, but they're accidents.
Famous American scholar of Buddhist studies, Donald Lopez, has entitled one of his book, Prisoners of Shangri-La. You know probably that book. Yes. Where he talks a lot about romanticization of Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhism in the West. What do you think about this? And especially keeping in mind that you are a well-known teacher of meditation also, giving all kind of introductions to the practices. How do you think, where do you see the main hindrances when we're talking about Westerners, about Europeans, to approach Tibetan Buddhist practice and to practice? There are some troubles in this.
Don, in that book, he addresses some of the sort of fantasies about Tibet that some people hold and held, and the problems with those. For instance, when I used to bring groups, after my training, I went back to North America. I used to bring groups of 10 and 12 Tibetan Buddhists, Tibetan lamas or Tibetan monks to tour 100 to 120 cities at a time, doing sacred music, sacred dance. And people, when we would arrive, they'd have all kinds of fantasies about how these guys must be almost like all saints or something like that. Something like that, like they must all be very saintly. Whereas, of course, the older monks were more saintly and more deeply practiced, and the middle monks were middly advanced, and the young monks were full of testosterone. So I would always have to tell the young monks to, be a little careful around Western ladies, because our Western ladies in America, we don't really have the kind of Asian way of treating monks, and they could easily be misunderstood. And I think, that often happens. In fact, one of the second tour I brought over, we didn't have any, very old monk with us. So I said to the monastery, I think we should have one, really senior old lama with us. And so the monastery gave me this one guy who was about 80 years old, and he was next in line to be head of Dalai Lama school, and in fact, he became that. And before leaving, everyone sat around the table. There were the 12 monks and me and the abbot and everyone would say a little bit about things that they think, their hopes and wishes and aspirations. And I said, well, I'm very content with everything except with our old 80-year-old monk. I'm a little nervous. He's been in a monastery all his life. He doesn't know how beautiful our Western women are. he's going to go like get in America, and he's just going to fall head over heels in love with every girl he sees, and he'll disrobe and never come back. And all the other monks knew me quite well, so they knew I was joking. But the old monk, he had just come out of a 3-year retreat, and he didn't really know me at all. So he looks at me and says, "Oh, no, don't worry, Glenn, I'm okay." But there is that kind of fantasization. I mean, everyone looks for a hero or a heroine, sort of a perfection, sort of projection of perfection. So even with Tibet, you know, Tibetans all think of Tibet in a very romantic way. But certainly, you know, they had hailstorms and rainstorms, occasional earthquakes. You know, they, like any other country on earth, diseases came and went, and little wars and skirmishes came and went, and so forth. So I think Don's book was to sort of point out that overly fantasizing Tibet as a country or as a culture was a little bit of a dangerous thing. He probably also did it, I think, for commercial academic reasons. In America, professors are sort of pressed a little bit to be critical of whatever it is they're teaching. They shouldn't be too close to it. So he might have had that in mind as well. I would say from my side, though, I do think Tibet is the most beautiful nation in the world. I just love being at 5,000 meters and the brightness of the stars and the sun and all of those things, all very, very fabulous. I love Tibetan people and their humor very much. It's people who come to Dharamsaloye unable to speak any Tibetan, and Tibetans couldn't speak any English, but you could sit with a Tibetan unable to exchange a single word and not feel uncomfortable. They would be able to communicate just with simple eyes and switching of the eyebrows and moving of the hands. It's a very unique culture. So in some ways, it is a little bit of a Shangri-La, I think, or it was a bit of a Shangri-La. And the people were very, very, and are very, very special, very beautiful, very blessed. I mean, after all, for about 1,500 years, I would say that the major portion of their effort went to the spiritual life, and not spiritual life to the detriment of secular life. But they really, you know, the name of the Tibetan is Sishi Zungtrao, Genden Potrang Sishi Zungtrao. Genden meaning dedicated to joy, the body and the mind in harmony. And literally the peace and the world in harmony, but their peace means your mind is at peace, and the world, means everything in your physical life, to have those two in balance and harmony. I think it's a very beautiful idea, and very beautiful ideal, I should say. And that Tibetans did achieve that to a certain extent, more than I think Don likes to give them credit for, or was willing to give them credit for in that particular book, because of various issues that were coming up at the time. Yeah.
Also, I would like to touch another aspect of your tremendously intensive activity. You are acting also as a curator of art exhibitions and publications of art albums dedicated to various aspects of Tibetan iconography. Just to mention some albums like The Mystical Arts of Tibet, The Art of Compassion, Portals to Shangri-La, The Flying Mystics of Tibetan Buddhism. But yesterday we discussed about one book that I personally consider to be very much important, not book, but an album of Tibetan iconography, The Female Buddha, Woman of Enlightenment in Tibetan Mysticism. What I wanted to say that I remember some years ago, one of my university students, girl, she told me, oh, look, all history of Buddhism is very much masculine, starting from Buddha himself, from the previous Buddhas, up to present Dalai Lama. Man, 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 man. What about the contemporary gender equality issue? What is the position of the woman in Buddhism? So it seems to me that this, your prepared exhibition and album, The Female Buddha, actually provides for us a completely different perspective, different understanding, because this is a book or album about the Taras, about the Dakinis, about extremely significant, especially in tantric Buddhist perspective, feminine aspect. Can you tell more about this I would say, still comparatively neglected aspect of Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist tradition?
Yeah, there's, if we look over Buddhist history, again, the Buddhists like to talk about it, Tantric Buddhists as outer, inner, and secret. And on the outer level, the transmission happens largely through the monks. And this is just kind of a historical idiosyncrasy, I would say, that when Buddha was teaching and walking around, I would say walking around, because Buddha never lived in one place. He basically wandered for 45 years. I think maybe a little bit like Christ, although Christ was just 4 years as a teacher in the Middle East. Many hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would walk following him. So the Buddha would just basically make a circuit, and men and women alike would just drop what they were doing and just walk with him for a few weeks or a few months or a year, and each time they would walk a certain amount of distance every day and then camp at night, and in the morning they get up and do meditation, and the Buddha would give some discourse, some teaching, often the same in the evening. And sometimes when they arrived, he mainly walked between 8 different kingdoms. And often in the central part of that kingdom, they would stay for a few weeks or even as much as a month and a half, and just stay in the one place. So at that time, it was no discrimination between male, female, or so on. And whoever came and walked, they just came and walked. So there's many stories of Buddha's meeting with all kinds of people in that way. After the Buddha passed away, then one of the kings called a conference of monks to record some of the teachings. So really it's the third council which is important in defining how Buddhism became on the outer level, called by King Ashoka in, I don't know, roughly 250 BC, something like that. When Tibetans argue dates, they're often wrong by 200 or 300 years in those ancient times, because history was written on palm leaves, and palm leaves don't survive that many monsoons. So modern dating is perhaps a little more accurate. And that conference was headed by monks. And so King Ashoka only invited monks to come. So whatever is said, the monks get to play the main role. So we call that outer Buddhism. Inner Buddhism, the Bodhisattva path, has sort of equal men and women in almost all traditions, until Buddhism goes to China. And in China, how kings tend to sponsor things affects how Buddhism goes. Like here in Vilnius, for example, you guys were old-time religion for many centuries. And then someone decided you guys should become Christian. And so there's an invasion and some political actions. And then whoever wins the war gets to say quite a bit about how it will be. So it's a little bit like that as Buddhism travels from country to country. And so in the Mahayana, it's pretty well equal, male and female, but in the council from Ashoka, the so-called outer Buddhism, because the books are all written and the rules by men, by monks, we can definitely say men have an advantage. And then Tantra side, Buddha gave many of his tantric lineages to women, and over the centuries, women played very important roles in those transmissions. And therefore, the Dalai Lama often says, if we just divide into Sutra and Tantra, we can say Sutra meaning outer, and Tantra, inner meaning Tantra, Tantra meaning inner. If we just divide in those two ways, we can say men have a bit of an advantage in outer Buddhism, Sutra Buddhism, and women have the advantage in secret Buddhism or in the Tantric tradition. And so I wanted to do that exhibition on female Buddhas, an art exhibit, and also an accompanying catalog or book or album to show the role that the feminine form has played in Buddhism over the centuries, and also the very important role that many great female masters have played over the centuries. Now, when Buddha was once asked, what about men and women and enlightenment? His reply is very clear. Well, I mean, we can't really trust the reply because it's written later by monks. But anyway, as much as you can trust anything from Buddha in that it's written by later people, he says in terms of enlightenment, there's no difference between the two. In terms of enlightenment potential, no different between the two. And if we look at Tibet, although Dalai Lama and then Panchen Lama were the first two in the spiritual hierarchy, the third was actually a female Tulku, Dorje Pamo. And until today, her monastery still survives in Tibet and her lineages. And technically, if the Dalai Lama strikes out and the Panchen Lama strikes out, she would be the main spiritual authority for all of Central Asia, so to speak, a kind of a female Dalai Lama, if you would. And I think often when we speak of equality of sexes, we have a problem in that people often look at a particular issue. Now, for instance, I often hear in America, Western women grumbling about those poor Chinese women having to bind their feet because having small feet makes you look sexy. To a Chinese person, small feet is sexy. Personally, I like big feet. But they'll complain. That's very sexist of the Chinese to say that small feet are sexy, because then it's going to make the women bind their feet so they don't get too big in their teen years and they have small feet. But at the same time, some woman will be complaining about that, but she'll be standing there in 4-inch stiletto high heels, which she doesn't think at all is contradictory. I mean, she doesn't say, I'm wearing 4-inch stiletto high heels, so every man in this room should put on stiletto high heels. So often we fixate on those things that are different than our culture without really looking much internally at how our own culture plays those games. I'm very fond of a Canadian sort of radical professor, Jordan Peterson, who sort of questions a lot of the politically correct values, so-called politically correct, which I think many of them are politically very incorrect. And he questions very strongly, because often we look at things, like for instance, women wear makeup and lipstick. Why not insist that men wear makeup and lipstick in order to be, and you know, I might benefit a little bit from some lipstick. But if I wear lipstick, it sort of looks too effeminate. And ladies say, hey, I'm not going to give you a kiss with those red peach lips.
But I think maybe if His Holiness Dalai Lama would decide to incarnate as a woman, that would be the best response to this kind of generic questions.
Well, I don't think there's a problem with Dalai Lama incarnating as a woman. There is a problem with whether or not people looking for the Dalai Lama would be able to find him. Because there's two things happen with looking for reincarnation. And I think you were mentioning we were having dinner the other evening and last night, and when the second Dalai Lama died, and they asked the state oracle where to find the reincarnation, he said, well, he's taken 100 simultaneous incarnations, so the difficulty will be to find the correct one. Because I think the idea in Buddhism is once you become an Arya, once you become a saint, you no longer are stuck to one ego model. You can sort of multitask, so to speak. So it's very possible that a couple of the ladies out here are incarnations of a Dalai Lama. I'm very highly trained. I can tell those giveaway signs. If you want to pay me $10,000, I can check later to see if you qualify. But it has to be a no money back guarantee. If you want to be proclaimed a Dalai Lama, it's more expensive.
What about Tibet? You've been visiting many times Tibet up to now, and working with Tibetan monks in Tibet, visiting monasteries. So what's your personal opinion about the future of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet? About the level of practice, about the level of teachings under very strict communist China, control.
Yeah, well, I mean, being occupied by a foreign country is never an ideal situation. And it certainly presents some problems for the Tibetans. Sometimes my Tibetan Lama friends in India and Nepal get irritated when I give a classical answer, a non-classical answer when they ask that. It's easier to, the Tibetan Buddhist studies in India are 10 times better than they are in Tibet, because the infrastructure is there and you don't have political interference in the programs. But in Tibet, the actual opportunity to practice meditation is actually better than in the refugee situation in India. Because Tibet is such a vast, vast country, and people just disappear into the mountains and go into a cave, and nobody's going to care. China's not going to care. It's much easier to do a 3 or a 5 year retreat in Tibet than it is in India or Nepal. So that side is a little positive. The downside in Tibet, well, there's really 2 Tibets. There's the Tibet Autonomous Region, which was created, which is really half of Tibet, created by China in 1967, 18 years after their proclamation of Tibet as being part of the Great Motherland. and then the part on the East Tibet which is outside of that. And so the outside has less interference. So many of those monasteries have 2,000 or 3,000 monks or nuns, some even more, and there's not a lot of interference with them. But if it's inside Tibet Autonomous Region, it's under basically military and secret police control. So every monastery has a police station within it, unofficially, ununiformed police, I should say. And they're always monitoring the monks and recording everything and videoing and so on and so forth. And the monasteries are really intended as a kind of a showcase of religious freedom, not just for foreigners, but, you know, thousands and thousands of Chinese people visit Tibet. And the problem really comes with the Chinese constitution. In the communist constitution, you're free to believe in religion or not believe in religion, but you're not free to propagate religion. And the Chinese word for propagate has the same kind of meaning as teach. And the problem is, any great tradition is not just saying, I believe I'm a New Guinea headhunter. You also have to learn how to hunt a head, and if you get a head, how to shrink it and how to hang it on your wall. So with Buddhism, traditionally, we have to study for 15 to 20 years to 25 years. That's a very intense study period. But for Chinese, propagate and teach, there's not really much of a difference. So they can totally control the study programs in Tibet. So only 2 of the monasteries in Tibet Autonomous Region have training programs even halfway equal to those in the great monastic institutions recreated by the Dalai Lama in India. That would be Tashi Lumbo, I think, is one. And probably Sera Monastery somehow has managed. And Samye is not traditionally a very strong training monastery. It's more like a pilgrimage monastery and a sort of a, you know, it's not like one of the ones where people get great degrees from. In Tibet, if you're a Nyingma, you got your degree probably from Mindraling Monastery or Dorje Truk. Those were the 2 great ones in central Tibet. And Samye was not really a monastery giving high degrees for the last 700-800 years. It just sort of started out like that. After that, it was really a monastery shared by all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, you had a quorum of monks who did what, and they were reasonably well trained, but not compared to, say, the Kshetra trainings in the Nyingma or Kagyu traditions or the great Chude, you know, Geshe programs of Ganden Drepung Sera and so forth. So study is a problem in Tibet, and for that reason, all of the best students get smuggled out of Tibet and put in the monasteries in South India. So if you go to like for instance, one reason I created sacred music, sacred dance was, say, Drepung Monastery in Tibet had about 10,000 monks. Only 250 escaped the communist Holocaust out of 10,000. They were settled in South India, and they were mostly adult. There were really very, very few young training monks, just the old ones. And then in the 1980s, with the liberalization in China, many hundreds and hundreds of Tibetans started coming out, especially for education. And so Drepung Loseling went from 200 monks to about 3,000 in a matter of a few years. And it was because they could not get a proper training back in Tibet. So it's improved in Tibet a little bit in the last 20 years, but still, under the communist regime, they think, you know, studying Buddhism is kind of silly. You should memorize some prayers and some rituals, and when the people come there, superstitious people, you want to fulfill their superstitions. Communists don't have a very highbrow reading of these kind of traditions. They have very low opinion of them.
But what about yourself? In spite of all your activities, you are not on the blacklist of Chinese party. You are allowed to enter Tibet nowadays?
Well, actually, this last attempt to go to Tibet 2 weeks ago, I and all my group were refused visas. I don't know if that means I'm blacklisted. I guess I'll find out next year. It could be for other kind of problems, like four difficult things happened for China this year, and one of them especially for us Canadians. And one was Canada arrested the lady who is the daughter of the owner of Highway, the Chinese internet company that Donald Trump is sort of really pressuring the CIA and the FBI to follow, because it's regarded very much as a spying operation. You know, even in China, to get an internet, you get fingerprinted. And if anyone uses your computer, you're the one responsible. Doesn't matter if you were there or not. So they got over 20 million people monitoring just domestically, let alone the millions and millions monitoring international traffic. So Canada arrested the daughter of who was acting CEO of Highway. So that made China very angry at Canada. They immediately arrested a few Canadians in China for spying and who weren't spying. They cut the visas of some Canadian professors in Canada, cut the business licenses of some Canadians in China, and so forth. I don't blame them for doing that. I blame our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, for arresting the daughter of the owner. I mean, that's like getting angry at someone and going over to their house and kicking their dog or kicking their cat, or kicking their child. It's a very unchivalrous thing to do. The other was Donald Trump said he wouldn't do business with China as usual unless China starts allowing journalists, ordinary people working for governments, and Tibetans who are citizens of modern countries to visit Tibet. Like right now, if you're a Tibetan American, you're not allowed to visit Tibet. If you're a Nepali with a Tibetan name, you cannot visit Tibet. If you're a journalist and they know you're a journalist, you cannot visit Tibet. And just on my 2 trips ago, one of our members was traveling from Brazil on a diplomatic passport, and her visa was refused because she's got a low-end job in some government ministry, education or something like that, but still she can travel on a diplomatic passport and doesn't have to pay visas, can walk through quick lines at airports and stuff. Well, she couldn't go. So those things made it this year difficult. Then the ambassador went, American ambassador, and came out and said that unless China talks to the Dalai Lama, it's difficult for America to have business as usual with China. So those 4 conditions got my visa canceled, which was very disappointing because I love going to Tibet every year. It's my sort of a highlight of my year. Plus, 3 years ago, I had commissioned a Thangka painting by the person I would say is the best living Tibetan artist. And it was ready for this year, and I was hoping to pick it up and whatnot, but I couldn't get in, so that's that.
By the way, you are dealing not only with Tibet, but as I remember, you've been traveling several times to Mongolia as well, and keeping good contacts with Mongolian Buddhists. So yes, what brings you there?
Well, that's kind of a karmic thing, I think. In 1978, my father-in-law in America helped the Dalai Lama get his first U.S. visa. And of course, that made Russia very jealous. And so they said, if he's going to America, he should come to Russia. And so in 1979, 3 months before going to America, he went to Russia and to Mongolia. And it just happened that at that time, I had published a book written by the 3rd Dalai Lama and taught used as his teaching manual when he traveled through the Mongol Republic between 1578 and his death in 1588. And Dalai Lama bought 50 copies of my book and gave it out in the libraries and to the president of Russia, and gave to the heads of the monasteries in Ulan-Ude, and then in Mongolia, one to the president and one to the head lama, and so on. So I had that kind of karmic connection. And then after being in the West for about 10 years, bringing over Lama tours, I wanted to go back somewhere to Asia, but it was a question where. Nepal at the time was having Maoist problems in the mountains, and I didn't want to go to India. I don't like Indian food, too many chilies and all of that, and China is a problem. So I was sort of tossing around for where to go. So I went to Tibet. There's an oracle lake where you look and you get visions. And that's where they go to find tulkus. And every Tibetan likes to go there once in their life and look into it to get sign of visionary prophecies. So I went and looked in the lake, and it's very beautiful. You get up to about almost 6,000 meters looking down into this little lake in the distance. Then you start getting dizzy and going into a mystical states of mind, partly from the altitude and so on. And then all the things that popped up in the lake. Basically, when I was on a teaching tour the next year, one after another, those images popped up in Mongolia. So then I took an apartment in Mongolia and held it for the next 7 years, and would stay there 4 months a year, and the rest of the year basically would do traveling and teaching.
So, but it seems to me that we're talking too much, both of us. I think that still we have some time for auditorium to put forward some questions. Would you like to use this occasion and to ask directly Glenn Mullin about something not necessarily directly related to the present book?
I would like to say that before doing that, I had requested Alice to choose one poem that he liked from her and that he thinks he translated reasonably accurately, and to read it. Yeah. Would you consider doing it?
Allo, sutiksi.
Come sit here and read one.
Perskaityt fragmentą savo vertimo.
I don't know if he can read poetry as eloquently as could the sixth Dalai Lama, who is not a monk and was a great writer, poet, singer. You want to sing?
You asked to read verses, poetry.
Yeah. Let's see. Rokas, can I borrow you for a minute? Come here. To hold the microphone for him, I need someone young and spry to hold the microphone. Let Alice come, that's okay. Or Rokas come.
Aš dabar paskaitysiu šeštojo Dalai Lamos, kuris vadinamas Tibeto numylėtiniu. Jis buvo labai laisvas žmogus. Labai laisvas žmogus, toks, sakysiu, hipis, irgi keliautojas. Nelabai mėgo vienuolystės, bet jis buvo labai ir meniškas žmogus, kuris rašė ganėtinai gražius eilėraščius, kurių aš, aišku, nemokėjau taip išversti, kadangi ten reikia labai akcentus sudėti visus. Tai aš taip paskaitysiu čia, nekreipkite dėmesio į mano vertimą, bet, sakysim taip. Užrašytus juodų rašalo žodžius, keli vandens lašeliai greit nuplauna, o tai, ką širdyje nupiešia meilė, giliai įsigeria ir lieka amžinai. Puikus tai buvo metas siųsti pavėjų geras mintis, jauna nepaprastai graži ponia, mane parsivedė namo ir davanojo meilę. Balti dantukai jūsų spindo šypsena žavinga, skirta visiems buvusiems kambaryje, bet jos akies kamputis bylojo apie meilę man vienam. Aš širdžių medžiotojas buvau, gražuoja angelišką sugavau, tačiau dėja, jie kitas ponas pagrobė iš manęs. Kai didžioji brangenybė buvo mano, aš nepakankamai ją saugojau, dabar jį prarasta ir skausmas man vienintelė paguoda. Tai užteks, manau.
Ačiū labai Aliui. Mes turime dar laiko kažkiek klausimams, turbūt turime. Tai ar būtų klausimų mūsų svečiai? Naudokime progą. By the way, also I would like to say that I became very much fascinated, I am using this word, this expression, with the works of Glenn Mullinan. When I got quite many years ago his book, Death and Dying, the Tibetan Tradition. And for me was perhaps the most important book on tradition of death and dying in Tibetan Buddhism. Because even we had later translation from Tibetan by Audius of so-called Tibetan book of death, still this book by Glenn Mullinan seems to me is most comprehensive and even most practical. And yesterday we discussed with Ignas Tashkevičius, who is here and who is the main person behind the stage, dealing actively with all publications and translations of Sophocles on Buddhist issue. Yesterday we discussed that maybe in some future we'll get also Lithuanian translation of this book on death and dying in Tibetan tradition as a complementary work for Audius translation of the Tibetan Book of Death, and that would be good another occasion to attract Glenn Mullinan to Vilnius, to have him again. But still, I hope that probably even Vilnius University will be able to invite in close future our guest to give some lectures for our university students. So hopefully looking forward that this is not the first and not the last meeting with our guest.
Yeah.
So, then, thank you very much once again. Thank you very much to our guest, to Glenn Mullinan. Thank you very much to Ignas, to Audius, who, because of you, will have this occasion also here. I'm looking forward for the next meetings.
And if anyone gets books, I'll sign them, yeah?
By the way, everyone who would like to get signature of our guest could approach with the book. Kas norit autografų svečio galima.
And I recommend people buy 3 copies and read it 3 times.
Why?
Improve circulation. Oh, I need a pen.
Oh, I will give. I have.